In the quiet Newport mansion, an envelope with no return address sat on the solid oak dresser. It was addressed to the maid, handwritten in blue ink, in a script far too elegant for a commoner. But before she could open it, someone did it for her. The letter contained secrets that should never be revealed to a man like that, a millionaire accustomed to buying silence, not confessing. From that moment on, nothing in the house would be the same again. What was supposed to be a plea for forgiveness turned into ruin, and the hidden love that had blossomed between the steps of the staircase and eyes that never met in the light of day would now be judged by those who would never understand what it means to love in secret. All because of a letter that fell into the wrong hands. She entered the room to gather the sheets and found the note torn in half, already read by other eyes. The murmurs in the hallways, his wife's cold gaze, the deadly silence of the other employees, everyone already knew. But not what he felt. They only knew what they wanted to know. The letter's contents had been distorted, spat out like poison at family gatherings, exposed as a vulgar betrayal. Only she knew that those words were a final act of courage from a man who, even surrounded by luxury, was terrified of loving someone who didn't fit the bill of his fortune. And now, with everything falling apart, she had to choose between disappearing or facing it. Because that letter, that damned letter, wasn't written on impulse. It was written by a man who wanted to be saved by someone like her. If this story has touched you, like and subscribe. The ending will give you goosebumps. The morning always began the same way in that house. The sound of the east wing clock struck 6 with surgical precision, followed by the slow creak of the laundry room door and light footsteps on the still cool marble. Helena walked with her head down, her uniform impeccably pressed, her hair tied back in a simple bun that never allowed a strand to escape. Her presence was nearly invisible, as was the Everhart house protocol. The Newport mansion stood like a silent fortress, surrounded by white columns and secrets buried beneath every Persian rug. Helena had never been treated with direct hostility, but she had also never heard her name spoken kindly. There she was, the cleaning lady, the kitchen lady, the discreet one, and she accepted it. After all, the work was stable, the pay fair, and the silence. However, painful was predictable. What no one saw, however, was how her eyes wavered whenever they happened to meet Henry Everhart's, the millionaire, the heir to a fortune built on real estate, vineyards, and stocks she would never understand. He, always reserved, always formal, was too polite to seem interested, but in the moments when the world forgot to watch, there was a suspended breath between them, a dilated time, as if the universe wavered for a second, and that was enough to bring her back to reality even more forcefully. That morning, however, something was different. An envelope lay on the guest room dresser, exactly where she should never have looked, much less touched. The paper was thick, embossed with a coat of arms, and her name, hers, written in a slanted, firm blue script. She froze. It wasn't a mistake. It was for her. But before she could reach out, she heard footsteps, and she recoiled. She left the envelope there, untouched, as if the mere sight of it was sin enough. At dinner that night, the mood in the house was different. Not because of some external event, but because of something invisible, something that ran through the eyes of the staff, between the fingers of the crystal glasses, in the forced smiles of the family. Something had been discovered, and she, still unable to understand what, began to feel the ground slowly give way beneath her feet. The letter, the one that was hers, was no longer in the room, and she was beginning to realize that it was no longer a secret between her and Henry. Someone else had read it, and now nothing would be the same. She lay awake all night, unable to understand what had happened to the letter. The image of the white envelope with her handwritten name haunted her like a figure standing at the door, insistent and silent. Helena mentally replayed every step she had taken since that morning. Had someone followed her? What exactly had that letter said? Doubt was a blade, cutting slowly, unhurriedly, as the smiles in the mansion took on a more acidic tone with each passing day. The silence around her was no longer the same. Now there were hushed murmurs when she crossed the halls, a pause in the laughter when her presence was noticed, and most of all, the cold eyes of Henry's wife, Claire, which now seemed to truly see her for the first time, but not with curiosity, with judgment. The next night, a new note appeared, this time tucked discreetly into the pocket of the apron Helena hung in the locker room. No envelope, no signature, just one sentence: "You don't know who you're dealing with." Her hands trembled as she read it. Fear came dryly, quietly, like a shadow creeping by. But along with fear came anger. She had never crossed a line. She had never spoken more than necessary, never touched on the forbidden. If there had been any feelings between her and Henry, they were silent, respected distances, and glances that dared not stray too far. The letter, she was certain, could not contain anything. Shameful. Henry was not that kind of man. At least she believed so. But there, alone in the servants' quarters, she began to wonder, what if she was mistaken? What if he had written something else, something that could be used against her? Fear turned to paranoia, and Helena no longer knew if she was the victim of a trap or a misinterpreted passion. The only one who could clarify was him. But Henry now seemed more distant than ever. For the next 2 days, he avoided even the hallways she passed through. And when their eyes happened to meet, there was too much guilt in his eyes, not fear, guilt, as if he had failed to protect her. And she understood. The letter didn't fall. It was taken. Someone picked it up, read it, and spread it. On Friday, Claire hosted an intimate dinner with some family members and 2 influential high society couples. It was the kind of occasion where the staff were trained to move like ghosts, discreet, quick, absent. But that night, something different was being prepared. A play. When dessert was served, Claire raised her glass, looked at the guests and laughed softly, as if preparing to reveal a secret that burns on the tongue. And then, casually, she said, "Did you know we have a secret novelist among the staff? It seems someone has been receiving love letters here at home." Helena stopped breathing. The room froze for a second, amidst suppressed laughter and expectant looks. Claire continued, as if reading a made-up passage, but it was real. She began reciting excerpts from the letter, excerpts Helena had never read, because she hadn't had the time. And even without having read them, she knew this wasn't just love. It was confession. It was surrender. It was the kind of thing you don't say out loud. And now it was what everyone heard as dessert entertainment. The paper had fallen into the wrong hands, and now what was being judged wasn't just the letter. It was her. The morning after dinner, Helena was no longer seen as invisible. She was looked at too much, talked about too much, measured by forced smiles and heavy silences. What had once been discretion was now scandal. Not because of anything she had done, but because of something someone had decided to make public, distorted, and cruel. The letter that had never reached her hands was now a weapon, and she the perfect target. Love, if it could be called that, was never the problem. The problem was who she was. A maid. Simple. Too silent to belong in any story involving an Everhart. Henry didn't show up for breakfast that morning. The newspaper was delivered to the door as always, but it sat there, untouched. His car drove into town but returned empty. In the house the servants were restless, and the rumors were so numerous they were already merging with fabrications. They said he'd been thrown out of the marital bedroom, that he'd slammed doors, that he'd had a nervous breakdown, that he'd disappeared for a while, alone, to think. But no one knew what was true. So except Helena, who felt in every part of her body that he was fighting, not against his wife nor against society, but against himself. Because loving someone like her was like spitting on his own family crest, and he knew it. But she also knew that, at that moment, she was the one bleeding alone. Claire, for her part, seemed to float through the rooms like an actress satisfied with her own performance. The words of the letter she had read aloud had been carefully chosen and edited. She hadn't read it all, just enough to paint Helen as a fool, a seductress, an opportunist. The original content remained a mystery, but the damage had been done. Helena's name was now spoken with derision, with malice. And what hurt most was the realization that Henry had allowed it. Even in silence he had consented. He hadn't defended her, hadn't sought her out, hadn't stopped her. Mid-afternoon, the butler called her. He said Claire wanted to see her in the library. Helena went. Her steps were firm, her heart crushed. The library was the most imposing room in the house, with dark wood bookshelves to the ceiling and a window overlooking the garden. Claire sat in one of the leather armchairs, a glass of wine in her hand, and the letter, now crumpled and fingerprinted, lying on her lap. "You know what this means, don't you?" Claire said, holding up the paper. "This could ruin a lot of things, but it won't, because I won't allow it. Now, you're going to walk out that door, pack your bags, and tomorrow you won't be in this house anymore." Helena remained silent. She didn't cry, she didn't beg. She simply nodded and left. Because there, in that moment, she understood there was no point in fighting with words, that what was happening wasn't just personal revenge, it was social punishment. She had broken an invisible rule. She had touched, with her eyes, something that didn't belong to her. And now, she would be erased. Silently. That night, she began packing her things. Not many. A portrait of her parents, a book Henry had lent her, and which she would never return. Some clothes, and silence. Lots of silence, but no hatred. Not yet. Because deep down, Helena knew. The story was not over yet. Night fell without wind, as if the outside air refused to touch that house that now seemed to breathe poison through its walls. Helena stayed in her room until after midnight, sitting on the edge of the bed, her suitcase packed at her feet, her body still motionless. She had nowhere to go. Not immediately. But that wasn't what hurt most. What throbbed, what burned inside, was his silence. Henry. The man who had written the letter. The man who never reached out to her afterward. Who let her be dragged into the center of a public humiliation, and then sidestepped it as if he had nothing to do with it. And yet she knew that he felt it, that it wasn't a lie, that those words, even distorted by Claire's mouth, had come from his heart. So why did he seem so absent now? The hallway was dark when she decided to leave. She walked slowly, unsure of exactly what she was looking for, perhaps a gesture, a look, an attempt at salvation. But the house was asleep, except for a light on in the study. The door was ajar, and for a moment Helena hesitated, but her treacherous heart took the step she wanted to avoid. The crack in the door revealed Henry sitting at his desk, hunched over it, his face buried in his hands. When he saw her, it took him a second to react. But he didn't speak. He didn't get up, he just looked at her, and that was enough. "I'm leaving tomorrow," she said, her voice firm but low. "Thank you for everything." He took a deep breath, as if swallowing a knife. "That's not what I wanted. But that's what you allowed." Silence. Pain dripped from his gaze, and yet he didn't say what she needed to hear. The right words, the ones that would change everything. But they wouldn't come. Maybe out of cowardice, maybe out of fear, or maybe because he knew that. At that moment it was too late. "The letter was yours," he said finally, his eyes moist. "I wrote it for you, and they stole it, as they steal everything they don't understand." She wanted to respond, to say she forgave, that she understood, but she couldn't. There was something greater than love in that moment. There was the weight of a choice, and he had already made his. The next morning, she walked downstairs with her suitcase in one hand and silence in the other. None of the staff looked her in the eye. Claire didn't show up, Henry didn't either. But when she reached the front door, the driver was waiting. And on the passenger seat, an envelope, with her name on it. Just like the first time. She didn't open it. Not there. She put it in her coat pocket like someone carrying a piece of glass, and she left. The car passed through the iron gates like a cut in the flesh of memory. And in the back seat, Helena closed her eyes. There were no tears, not at that moment. But her heart, yes, was bleeding, because unspoken love weighs more than shouted love, and now she carried that weight alone. The car drove on for miles without Helena saying a word. The road seemed to stretch out in silence, as if the world were trying to spare her from reaching some definitive destination. The envelope lay on her lap, untouched, as if it still breathed the same suffocating air of the office where it had been written. The handwriting was the same, firm, elegant, too honest for someone who had learned to lie with posture and titles. But it was late, or so it seemed. With every passing minute, the thought of returning grew more distant. And even without opening the envelope, she already knew, everything inside now hurt more than it comforted. The small inn where she decided to stay for a few days was in a neighboring town, simple and unpretentious, the kind of place where names didn't matter as much as the service you provided. There she felt safe, invisible again, but in a different way. For the first time, that invisibility was a choice, not an imposition, and perhaps that's why on the second night she decided to open the letter. Sitting on the bed, with the window open to a cold, moonless night, she read it. The words began hesitantly. Henry had never been good at writing feelings, and perhaps that was why it had taken him so long to try. He didn't call her beloved, nor did he make promises. He spoke of himself, of the immense loneliness he felt, even when surrounded by everything, of the way she, with her small gestures and attentive eyes, seemed to have sensed something even he didn't know he was hiding. "You see me, Helena," one passage read, "and that scares me more than my family's contempt, because I see you too, and I see everything the world insists on ignoring." She reread the letter 3 times. Each time the words carried a different weight. It wasn't a confession of love in the traditional romantic sense. It was something rawer, more truthful, an admission of the soul. And most devastating was the final paragraph, where he begged her not to leave the house, that they would face the scandal, the judgment, the social poison together. "If you stay, I'll stay. If you leave, I'll disappear forever." But now the letter was late. She was already gone. She had already been humiliated, abandoned, expelled. And what was left was this: pretty words on white paper. Too late. Or maybe not. The next morning, Helena left the inn without saying where. She was going. She walked to the station and bought a ticket. But she didn't return to the mansion. She took another route. One she chose herself, without a letter, without a ride, without imposed silence. She didn't run away. She walked forward. Meanwhile, at the Everhart mansion, Henry stared blankly into the bathroom mirror. The letter he'd written had been delivered too late. Not because he wanted it, but because he'd let fear win. And now, what remained was a vast, empty house, where the whispers no longer existed. Claire had won, society had won, but he hadn't. Because losing someone who was never yours is the kind of defeat that screams silently for the rest of your life. The new town Helena headed to was small, with cobblestone streets and the smell of baking bread in the morning. She chose that place not for safety, but by intuition. Perhaps because no one knew her there, perhaps because no one expected anything from her. She got a job in a bookstore that also served coffee. And for the first few days, she barely spoke. Books were enough company. She carried Henry's letter folded inside a notebook, like someone carrying a wound well hidden between her stitches. She harbored no hatred, but she also no longer had hope. She simply carried on day after day, building a routine without ghosts. On the other side, in Newport, Helena's absence spread like mold. The room she once cleaned now remained closed. The sheets, changed by another maid, no longer smelled the same. Henry walked through the house like a visitor, aimless. On his desk, another letter began to form, shorter, more bitter. But he didn't finish it, because he had understood too late. Words are no substitute for presence, and quiet love, when it tries to cry out, already finds the other too far away to hear. One afternoon at the bookstore, a woman came in and asked for help finding a rare book of poetry. Helena kindly helped her, and when the woman sat down, she said something that echoed, "People think love is shown with grand gestures, but sometimes the greatest gesture is knowing how to step aside so the other person can move on." Helena smiled. She didn't respond. But that night, he unfolded the letter again and wrote on the back with the same blue pen he'd carried from Newport, "I didn't hate you. I just needed to survive." Months passed. The seasons changed. Henry disappeared from the newspapers, from parties, from social gatherings. Claire still had the name and the mansion, but he no longer belonged to her. People said he had traveled, that he was taking care of business abroad, that he needed time. But the truth was simpler. He was empty. Nothing distracted him. Nothing made sense. Because some people, when they lose themselves, don't seek replacements. They just walk deeper into the silence. And Henry was that kind of man. Helena, on the other hand, was starting to smile again, slowly, unhurriedly. The books she organized, the children who came with, their parents, the short conversations about poetry and coffee with milk. Everything was simple but real, and real was something she'd never experienced in Newport. One day, walking through the town fair, she bought a small new notebook. On the first page, she wrote, "You don't start from scratch, but from where your heart stopped hurting." Then he put Henry's letter away, like a closed chapter, or maybe just a suspended one, because she knew some stories don't need revenge, just time. It was on Mao. A cloudy morning that Henry finally made a decision. He didn't tell anyone, he didn't pack. He simply walked to the garage, got into his old car, the one he drove himself without a driver, and set off. With no destination in mind, he followed the road as if searching not for a place but for an answer. The letter, or what was left of it, was folded inside his wallet. The same one he'd written to Helena months earlier, but which had reached her too late. He didn't know where it was. He didn't even know if he still wanted to see it. But something inside him screamed that he had to try, not to undo the past, but so that at least she would know he hadn't forgotten, that she wasn't just a page he'd torn out, that she'd stayed inside. As he drove, he remembered the little things. The way she straightened the crooked pictures in the house, how she always gave him a second glance before leaving a room. Her restrained words, the look that said so much more than any gesture. Henry hated himself for not protecting it, for allowing others to shape the story that belonged only to the two of them. He didn't know if he wanted her forgiveness, but he needed to see her. Just once. Just to say you tried. In the small town where Helena now lived, time had a different rhythm. People knew each other by name, and the sound of the square was dominated by the church bell at noon. When he arrived, he parked far from the center, afraid of attracting attention. He walked along the sidewalks, observing. Simple storefronts and steam-fogged windows. He asked for a bookstore. He was guided there by a man selling oranges on the corner. "It's small, but it has soul," he said. Henry smiled, for the first time in months. When he reached the bookstore's wooden door, he stopped. Through the glass, he saw Helena behind the counter, stacking books. Her hair was loose, her gaze calm. She seemed different, or perhaps just closer to herself. He didn't enter. He stood there for long minutes without her, seeing him. And in that time he understood everything. That woman no longer needed him, not like that. She had rebuilt herself, without anger, without spectacle, only with time. And time, like a silent tide, had washed away what he hadn't had the courage to hold on to. He left an envelope on the front step with a single sheet of paper. A new letter. This time, short. No promises, no guilt. Just the truth. You saved me, and that's why I had to lose you. He got back into the car and drove off, before she could open the door. Minutes later, as she closed the store, Helena found the envelope. She read it right there, standing, and for the first time since leaving, she cried, not out of sadness, but out of relief, because now everything had been said, and what couldn't be lived through was at least understood. After that day, Helena continued going to the bookstore as usual. She arranged the books, served customers, and chatted with the children who came looking for stories of dragons and princesses. But now there was something different in her silence. It was no longer the emptiness of someone holding back tears. It was the silence of someone who understood what hurt, named what hadn't healed, and decided to carry on anyway. The letter Henry had left was kept in the same notebook where she had written her words months earlier. Now they were two voices, side by side. A dialogue that had never existed aloud, but which sealed something stronger than any conversation. Acceptance. In town, no one knew where she came from, and she never told anyone. Not out of shame, but because it no longer defined her. It was like an old photograph you keep in a box, a piece of who we were, but not of who we chose to be later. Every now and then, however, something in the air reminded her, a scent similar to Claire's, a specific book she had catalogued so many times in the mansion's library, a dark car parked on the street, too similar to Henry's. But she didn't look for it. She just felt it and let it pass. One night, as she was closing the bookstore, she saw a young man playing guitar on the sidewalk in the square. She sat alone on one of the wooden benches and listened. He was playing something melancholic, yet beautiful. The music seemed to whisper memories, but without hurting. It was as if saying, "You survived." And in that moment, she allowed herself to truly smile. The kind of smile that doesn't wait for applause or recognition. Just breath. Just life. Upon returning home, she found an envelope among the day's mail. It was from the local publisher. A text of hers, sent months earlier, had been accepted for publication in a collection of women's memoirs and chronicles. She didn't even remember sending it. But she had, perhaps in a moment of fleeting courage, the title of the chronicle, "The Letter I Didn't Read in Time," signed only as H. Not knowing what name to use, she had used the initial he had given her. When she published the text, she wasn't seeking fame, but the text found readers, and readers found in it their own silent stories, impossible loves, swallowed pain, and preserved dignity. The column circulated among women in the city, then ended up in an independent magazine, and finally arrived in Newport. Claire read it. Henry read it too. She never knew about it, but in that simple story, told calmly, there was everything. The look that is never forgotten, the absence that teaches more than presence, and the truth that sometimes love only fulfills its role when it forces us to go on alone, not as punishment, but as liberation. In the old mansion in Newport, the paintings still hung on the same walls, the silverware polished with precision by the new servants, the hallways cleaned with the same coldness as ever. But something had changed. Henry was no longer the man who descended the stairs with the stiffness of a host. Now he wandered around as if he belonged to the house's past and no longer to the present. The social dinners ceased. Claire remained there impeccable, enthroned like a living portrait of unshakable pride, but inside something in her had also hardened too much not to crack. The published letter, the one that had seemed only a discreet chronicle, made a different silence echo in the walls. Everyone knew. No one said. But he knew. When Henry finished reading the text, it took him days to react. He scanned the words as if trying to decipher a language he himself had created, and yet never fully understood. There was no anger in what she had written. There was no pressure. Only pain described as wind, something that passes, that leaves its mark, but cannot be seen. And perhaps that was why it hurt so much, because Helena had loved him without a cry, without conditions, without demands, and he had failed to protect her. The punishment was subtle, but eternal, watching her be reborn without him. In the city where she now lived, the text began to generate invitations. Nothing. Grand, just small gatherings with readers, conversation circles, requests for new writing. Helena accepted some. She declined others, because she wasn't seeking a stage, only truth. But each time she read her own story aloud, she felt something dissolve inside, as if the words, upon being heard, removed the dust of days of humiliation from her skin. Each sentence was an acknowledged scar, and each scar a place that no longer hurt. One day, at one of these gatherings, a young woman approached me. At the end of the reading, her eyes filled with tears, and she said, "I too loved someone who couldn't love me in public. I thought my story was ugly, but you made it beautiful." Helena smiled. She touched the young woman's shoulder and replied, "Some stories aren't meant to be lived. They're meant to be felt, and that's saying a lot." That night, he returned home and stared out the window for long minutes. It was raining, the same rain that had accompanied her the day she left Newport. But this time she wasn't being fired. She was being cleaned. Life hadn't been fair, but she had been true to herself, and that was the silent victory no one could take away from her. In the mansion, Henry went up to the attic, where he kept boxes of old mementos. Among them, he found a book. The book Helena always read in the garden at the foot of the apple tree. The inscription was his, written years before, without knowing it would be the most intimate object they would ever have. He held the book to his chest, as if holding someone who won't return, and in that moment he understood. True love sometimes only exists when we let go. Autumn arrived slowly, painting the city's leaves in shades of gold and rust. It was Helena's favorite season, though she'd never told anyone. She liked the sound of dry leaves underfoot, the smell of coffee mixed with the chill that drifted in through the open windows, the feeling that the world was about to change, yet still resisted. She walked the streets in a thick coat and a blue scarf she'd received from an elderly client, a gift without a reason, just a silent gesture of affection. That was how things worked now, quietly, but with truth. One day, while sorting through the newly arrived books at the bookstore, she came across a new volume of short stories, and as she leafed through it, she froze. One of the stories bore a familiar name. Not her own, but something only someone very observant would recognize. The name of the small village where she and Henry often passed by the same paths, never once seen together. The story was short but clear. It told of a man who wrote a letter, but the letter never arrived, and of a woman who read everything with her heart, even without having read it with her eyes. The author? A pseudonym. But she knew. She felt it. Henry had written. Not as an answer, nor as a confession, but as a record, as someone who needs to leave something in the world that the world didn't see happen. Helena felt her hands tremble, not from cheap emotion, but from recognition. There was the same silence in it that she now understood, that of someone who loves in silence, fails in trying to protect, and accepts losing because holding on would be selfish. She bought the book. She didn't tell anyone. She kept it with the other two, the first letter and the second. Now they were 3 pieces of a story that only they knew to be true. That same week, she received an envelope with a foreign postmark. Inside, a letter. From the publisher. They informed her that her story would be translated into English and published by a literary collective abroad. They invited her to a reading in Boston, months away. The shock was great, but it didn't derail her, because now she no longer needed to prove herself. Whether or not she went would be a free choice, without fear, without urgency, and that's how she decided to accept. Boston was cold, grey, and grand, but the auditorium was welcoming. Helena took the stage with her usual measured steps, holding the paper containing the chronicle in her hands. She read softly without theatrics, just truth. When she finished, a silence hung before the applause, and in that space between the last word and the clapping, something stirred within her. It was peace, it was liberation, it was the certainty that even without a happy ending, that story didn't need to be corrected, because it was already beautiful in its pain and whole in what was never complete. In the audience, among dozens of faces, a pair of eyes watched her. He didn't stand, he didn't walk over to her, but he smiled. Discreetly. She didn't see it, but perhaps she felt it. On the flight home, Helena stared out the window as if searching for something in the clouds. There was no party. There were no flowers at the airport. Just her, with her light suitcase and a different heart. For the first time, she felt like she belonged, that her story, told in simple words, had traversed the world, without needing scandal or portraits, and now she was returning not with glory but with integrity, something she had almost lost in that mansion, where she had learned the price of silence and the value of dignity. In the small town where she lived, neighbors celebrated her trip with smiles and brief hugs. The bookstore had sold out of the collection. Readers came looking for her, asking when the next text would be published, suggesting topics and stories, but she just smiled, because she didn't write for others. She wrote so as not to forget herself. Days later, he found a new envelope among his mail. There was no return address, just a folded sheet of paper, undated, with a single handwritten sentence. "Some loves are born to teach us to leave, not to stay." The line was familiar, but more mature, more restrained. And she knew it was his. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just closed his eyes for a moment. It was as if, little by little, the two of them were building a silent conversation, made of letters scattered along different paths, but connected by an invisible thread that neither of them dared break. There were no plans, no reunions, no expectations, just gestures, echoes, a distant presence. And perhaps that was the closest thing to peace they could achieve. One Saturday afternoon, walking through the square, Helena stopped at a used bookstall. Among the worn, yellowed volumes, she found a copy of Henry's first work, the novel he had written as a young man, before inheriting his fortune, before losing himself in the silence of appearances. She bought the book on impulse. At home, leafing through the pages, she found a dedication written in pencil, as if it had been written for no one in particular, for those who see what no one else has seen. She closed the book carefully and placed it on the shelf among the others. Now her bookshelf was a secret map of everything she had experienced, the books they read in silence, the torn letter she never read. First, the words they both wrote separately, but with the same emptiness between the lines. And among these fragments, she reconstructed herself. One rainy night, as she drank tea and stared out the window, she thought of him, not with pain, but with gratitude, because despite everything, Henry had given her something no one else had ever offered, a love that, even though denied to the world, taught her to see herself with new eyes. And that, she knew now, was stronger than any declaration. The Newport mansion, the piano in the main living room, remained closed, but sometimes at night, someone would open it and play notes no one recognized. An unfinished melody, like a story that would never be erased. Winter came early that year. Mornings brought frost to the rooftops, and the bookstore windows fogged up before 8. Helena wore thick gloves, and teacups became a permanent fixture on the counter. But there was warmth, not the warmth of the past, nor the warmth of her body. It was the warmth of knowing that despite everything, she had survived intact in something many lose: self-respect. Readers still came, some just to see her, others to hear her words, and there were those who came silently, as if simply being near her was enough. She welcomed them with the same care she once had for folding sheets and arranging cutlery. Now, however, it wasn't out of obligation. It was by choice. In the mansion, Henry now lived alone. Claire had left months earlier, taking only her last name. The divorce didn't make the papers. It was treated with the same silence as so many things in that house. The Everharts still had a fortune, but they had lost the mirror. The image of social perfection had cracked, and Henry, finally, no longer cared. He spent his days among books, old letters, and a desk where he wrote short stories with names no one knew. He never published. He just wrote, because writing was the only way he'd found to continue existing without sinking. One day, walking through the mansion's deserted garden, he found an envelope hidden between the pages of a book left on the porch bench. It was a letter I never remembered writing, but the handwriting was his, and the content even more so. In it, he told Helena everything he hadn't had the courage to say at the time: his fear of rebelling against the family name, his dread of being seen as weak, the cowardice he'd mistaken for rationality, and in the end, the question he never asked: if I had asked you, "Dad had run away with me that morning, would you have come?" He smiled bitterly. It was late, and maybe it would have been better that way, because she had built something beautiful without him, and he needed to accept that sometimes the greatest act of love isn't staying, it's letting the other person go, whole. And even alone, Henry felt she was with him, not in person, but in memory, in every line she wrote, in every silence that no longer hurt so much. That same week, a letter arrived for Helena. It was unsigned, just a book inside the envelope, on the back cover a dedication in familiar handwriting. "To the one who taught me to be true, even if I learned late." She held the book for long minutes. She read the dedication again, and this time she didn't cry. She just smiled, because now the cycle was closing, the words finally found their place, and the hurts no longer had a place to live. The last day of December dawned with a light snow covering the city streets. Helena opened the bookstore early, as she did every New Year's Eve. It was her tradition to start the day in silence, alone among her books, as a way of thanking time for shaping her without hardening her. She wore a thick sweater and woolen socks. The world outside was white, immaculate, as if everything had been rewritten overnight. She spent the morning organizing the volumes on her memoir shelf, and as she reached the top, a small box fell to the floor. It was plain cardboard, closed with string. It had been there for months, perhaps forgotten among the delivery boxes. Opening it, she found something that made her breath catch. Inside was a typed manuscript with the title in all caps, The Letter That Arrived Later. The author, Henry Everhart. No pseudonym, no protection. Helena held the pages with both hands. The text was different from the previous ones. It wasn't a chronicle, it was a play, a monologue, and the main character was called simply She. The words described not only the relationship between boss and maid, but the emotional underbelly of a man trapped by his own cowardice and a woman who dared to love herself more than submit. It was painful, raw, and at the same time poetic. A plea for forgiveness transformed into art. A belated gesture that sought not redemption, but testimony. At the end of the play, a final typed note. This play is not about what we lost. It's about what we had the courage to feel, even when we couldn't live. Inside the box, a handwritten note. Brief. Written in the same blue ink as before. If fate is fair, we'll see each other on the other side, where love doesn't need to be hidden. She sat on the floor of the bookstore. She didn't cry, she didn't smile, but she felt every word, every pause. It was as if the cycle had been waiting for this moment to close, not with noise, but with presence. The following week, she received a call from a Boston publisher. Henry had delivered the manuscript before Christmas, with instructions to publish it in his name and send it to her. He didn't want her to approve it. He wanted her to know that this was his way of saying that, in the end, he'd learned. And so, he was leaving. Days later, a piece of news quietly spread through the local press. Henry Everhart had been found in his home, sleeping peacefully with no signs of distress. Beside him was a copy of the collection in which Helena had first published. The marked page was the short story, The Letter I Didn't Read in Time. Fate did not punish him with loneliness. It only accompanied him with truth. At the funeral there was no crowd, just a few familiar faces, and a woman in a grey coat who stood in the distance, silently among the trees. No one saw her. She didn't need to. Her presence there was symbolic. It was a goodbye without anger, a farewell without debt. That same night, Helena returned home and wrote in the notebook where she kept everything. The story ended before it began, but it taught us the essential thing, that love is not possession, nor a plan, nor salvation. It's just what we carry when we no longer expect anything in return. He closed the notebook and put the manuscript away, and slept in peace. Because karma hadn't forgotten anyone. It just waited for the right time to put everything back in its place, even if that place was inside, and only inside.